Morning, everybody. Um, I'm Neil Kelman. For the next 2 weeks, I'm chair of the Department of Family Medicine still at Mount Sinai. Uh, it's just to make a couple of announcements before we start. Um, this will be my last introduction of Grand Round Speaker as chair of the department. Um, I'm really proud to announce that on April 1st, Dr. Red Schiller, who you know very well, will be taking over as department chair as I eke my way towards something they call retirement. And the board of directors of the Institute has also named Dr. Eric Gale, who you know well, who will be taking over as the president and CEO of the Institute on April 1st. Just one last thing, we are planning our first fundraising gala, and that will happen on May 1st at the New York Academy of Medicine. So we'll be having some fun and listening to some music and doing some other good things and honoring a few people. So it is a great pleasure tonight, this morning rather, to introduce why am I saying doctor? Al Engelberg, because he probably knows as much about medicine as we do. Um, Al is the name of our department, the Engelberg Department of Family Medicine and Community Health, and has been a supporter of the Institute, almost since its beginning. Um, he graduated from NYU Law School in 1965, received a degree in chemical engineering from Drexel in 1961. He's had a legal career of more than 50 years and specialized in intellectual property law. He's widely regarded as the legal father of the modern generic drug industry because of his contributions to the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act of 1984, which many of you know as the Hatch-Waxman Act. It created the modern generic drug industry. As a patent counsel to the Generic Pharmaceutical Industry Association, he created the framework for enforcing and challenging pharmaceutical patents, which is central to that law. Subsequently, he initiated and successfully concluded legal challenges to patents claiming commercially important drugs, including Flexeril, Tenormin, Corgard, Lopressor, Avental, Buspar, and Norcuron. Those litigations enabled generic competition to begin early and paved the way for more than 10,000 patent challenges over the last 40 years. He recently published a book called Breaking the Medicine Monopolies, Reflections of a Generic Drug Pioneer. And it is a read, I will tell you. It's really interesting. It provides an intimate account of these events and more from his 50 years as a lawyer, advocate, and philanthropist engaged in making medicines more affordable. In 92, Engelberg founded the Engelberg Foundation, which has made over $100 million in grants to support philanthropic endeavors, including the creation of the Engelberg Center on Innovation, Law, and Policy at NYU, the Engelberg Center on Healthcare Reform at Brookings, the Family Practice Residency Program at Beth Israel by the Institute for Family Health, and the creation of the Department of Family Medicine at Mount Sinai's Icahn School of Medicine. He's also helped us build some of our practices, and we are greatly indebted. He has been our major philanthropic support from the beginning of the Institute, and we're really proud to have him here. It took a long time to get him here, and I think you'll find his story to be absolutely fascinating, as we did. And we will be, for anybody that puts your name in the chat and you're interested, we'll be supplying copies of this book free of charge to you. So feel free to, when you've heard this story, you're going to want to read about it. Al, I'll turn it over to you, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Neil. First, let me congratulate you on a great career. I know you're going to be missed by all your colleagues, and it's been a pleasure for me to work with you and support the organization for what is now 35, I think, since 1990 or so. And I hope we'll continue to stay in touch and even figure out how to play golf as we move forward. I know it's rare for a lawyer to speak to a group of doctors, but I was happy to accept Neil's invitation because I think it's important for doctors to have a basic understanding of the pharmaceutical business. Prescription drugs account for roughly 10% of all healthcare costs, about 600 billion annually. But drug prices get a lot of attention because all drugs are not routinely covered by insurance, and patients often face a significant payment or copayment. May come as a surprise to many of you, but when I got started on all this, it was the 1970s, and we didn't get a Medicare drug benefit until 2006. Sometimes patients don't take their medications or they don't take them as prescribed because they can't afford them. Sometimes they don't take them because they're confused about a change in the name or appearance of a medication and are afraid to take it for fear that it's the wrong medicine. So the more doctors know about drug costs, the quirks of brand generic competition, and the business of pharmaceuticals generally, the more likely it is that they'll be able to help patients maximize the value and minimize the cost of their medicines. So let's start with the big picture. In the mid-1970s, when I first got involved, the generic drug industry barely existed. Total sales of prescription drugs were less than 10 billion. Generic drugs were not a factor and accounted for less than a billion in sales. But today, some almost 50 years later, generic drugs fill 92% of all prescriptions, and sales of generics are well over $100 billion. But here's the problem. The 8% of prescriptions filled by new brand name medications, now mostly biologic drugs, account for 84% of all the money we spend on drugs. While everybody makes a big deal about the trillions of dollars that have been saved by using lower cost generic drugs, almost nobody mentions or even realizes that most of these savings have gone into the pockets of greedy pharmaceutical companies in the form of much higher prices for new drugs. In 1984, when Hatch-Waxman was enacted, the market value of Pfizer was 7 billion, which is 21 billion adjusted for inflation. Its actual value today is 186 billion, a nine-fold increase. Merck's is 262 billion, an 11-fold increase. And Lilly has astoundingly increased from a billion to 900 billion over this time. The drug industry has been one of the most profitable industries in America, with annual returns exceeding 20% of sales. That's almost 3 times the return of the S&P average company. By contrast, median family income adjusted for inflation has shrunk by 5%, and it's only about $75,000 today. But per capita drug costs, which were $415 in 1980 adjusted for inflation, are now triple that, almost $1,500. The bottom line is that pharmaceutical companies have gotten rich, and the cost of life-saving medicines have become a financial burden for the average family. For decades, politicians have been repeating the false mantra that the high cost of drugs is due to the high cost of research to discover them. It's just not true. The truth is that too many politicians, including liberal Democrats from the Northeast states and the industrial states, take money from pharma companies and regularly vote for huge amounts of corporate welfare in terms of tax breaks and extra monopolies and exclusivity protections for pharmaceutical companies. Pharma doesn't even invest in basic research anymore. Instead, it depends on the NIH intramural research program for new product ideas. I wonder how long that's going to last with the new cuts. And no politician does anything about the fact that the drugs that are invented in the US with federal funding are routinely manufactured offshore in places like Ireland, so that the bulk of the profits from from the pharmaceutical intellectual property are booked offshore and aren't even taxed in the United States. Even our academic institutions, including Mount Sinai and some of its neighbors, are busy striving for billion-dollar paydays at taxpayer expense by sharing their discoveries with industry with no restraint on the prices charged to patients or their own hospitals even for the drugs they invent. At NYU, Remicade earned NYU more than $1 billion in revenue. At Northwestern, it was Neurontin. There are probably other examples you're all aware of. If someone had told me 50 years ago that the creation of a robust generic drug industry would lead to a world in which new medicines routinely cost $50,000 per patient per year and new gene editing therapies $2 or $3 million per year, I would have thought they were nuts. But that's where we are today. So what is a generic drug and why do generic drugs even exist? The answer is simple. Most new drugs are protected by one or more patents that give the patent owner the exclusive right to sell the drug for a decade or more after it's launched. While the monopoly exists, prices are high so that the innovator can recover the cost of the research to discover the drug and make a handsome profit. There had to be some mechanism for creating competition that would lower the price of older drugs once the monopolies expired. The Europeans handle it in a different way. They largely operate national single-payer healthcare systems and can limit the price that suppliers to those systems charge for drugs. So the monopolies are less of a problem, and the need for generic drugs has never been greatly felt there. But that's not the American way. We believe in competition. That required a mechanism for allowing competitors to sell a lower cost identical product once the patents expired. We call those products generic drugs because they're sold under the actual name of the drug instead of the brand name or trademark, which is created by the originator. It's a really dumb system if you think about it. The innovator, most drugs have three names. They have a chemical name, which you learn in medical school, perhaps, and never see again. A generic name created by national or international conventions, which is a made-up name. Take, for example, the name for Valium is diazepoxide. I'm not quite sure how they create that. And then you have a trade name, say Valium, which is given to the product by the manufacturer at some early stage of its development. But the way the marketing of drugs has evolved over time, and certainly the way it was in the 1970s when I first got involved, was that the innovator drug, Valium, for example, was launched to the public as Valium, was promoted to doctors as Valium, was promoted to patients as Valium. And if you asked anyone who was involved in prescribing or taking the drug what the name of the drug was, they would tell you it was Valium. And if you asked them what diazepam was, they were clueless. So because of that and a couple of other things I want to mention, the generic drug industry was hanging by a thread. There was really no market for a generic drug because because nobody knew what diazepam was. And worse yet, most states in the early 1970s had what were called anti-substitution laws, which meant that if a prescription was written for Valium, it had to be filled with Valium. It could not be filled with a generic version of the drug because that was trademark infringement. Many of you probably experienced going into a diner or a restaurant and asking for a Coke and have the waitress say to you, "We don't have Coke, we have Pepsi." Um, it's similar to that situation. Coke is a trademark of the Coca-Cola company, and they went to great lengths to protect it. by ensuring that it wasn't used as the generic name for Coca-Cola. Um, when I first got involved, generic drugs were sort of hanging by a thread because they had the naming problem. But even though drugs only amounted to 10 billion in sales at that point, um, states became concerned that the drugs that were available were expensive, and that patients couldn't afford them, and they began to change the laws to allow for substitution rather than anti-substitution. And what that meant, and it began in Kentucky, I believe, but New York was one of the first adopters. New York adopted a law that basically said that when a physician writes a prescription for Valium, that it really is a prescription for Valium or equal, and that the pharmacist, originally it was voluntary, but it became mandatory, must substitute a lower cost generic equivalent drug. So that became a powerful incentive because that made a market for generics to get into. But they had two other problems that prevented them from taking advantage of that market. One was that there was no way to get generic drugs approved, and I'll get to that in a minute. And the other was that the major drug companies began suing generic drug companies uh, for making the drugs in the same size, color, and shape as the original drug. Basically, and I started out my career litigating these types of cases, defending generic drug manufacturers. The brand name companies claimed that the appearance of the capsule, the color combination, the shape, all identified Valium, and that if you couldn't sell a generic copy in the same appearance because that was part of the trade dress and was essentially a trademark. It didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense from a health and safety point of view because patients would get their didn't see the drug before they purchased it. They would get home in the late evening, get ready to take their medicine at bedtime, open up the prescription bottle and see a drug that was a different color than what they had taken before. Look at the label and see diazepam and not Valium. And of course, if they were smart, they wouldn't take the drug. They would call their doctor, and physicians were being bombarded with these kinds of calls. But the courts basically, for a long time, upheld um, the claim that this was legitimate trade dress and treated generic drugs as though they were counterfeit drugs. Um, Many of these lawsuits came to an end because some courts, after generic substitution became legal, began to understand that the appearance of a drug was functional and served a useful purpose in helping patients identify their medication. But there's a hangover effect today, and many of you may see it in your practices, where a generic drug does not look the same, and worse yet, the appearance changes from time to time. Every time the pharmacy changes to a new manufacturer who makes the drug in a slightly different appearance. By far, the biggest problem that generic drug companies had was FDA law in the 1970s required um, proof that a drug was safe and effective. And as far as the FDA was concerned, a generic drug was still a new drug and and was required um, uh, uh, to have proof of independent proof of effectiveness in order to get approved. That essentially meant that generic drugs had to go through a clinical trial. And that was a very expensive and time-consuming practice. And most of the generic drug companies were small family businesses, many of them located in the greater New York area, and they simply couldn't afford it. So by the time we got to the late 1970s, there were more than 100 drugs on which patent protection had expired, and there were no generics. Um, the generic industry at that point formed a trade association for the express purpose of getting the law changed so that generic drugs could be approved on an expedited basis. Um, and what that meant was they wanted drugs to be approved on the basis of proof that the generic was the same as the previously approved brand name drug. The technical term for that in FDA parlance was that the drug was bioequivalent. Bioequivalence could be established by a simple test in which two small groups of patients were taken, were maybe 20, 25 people in each group, were given the drug, one group given the brand name drug, the other group given the generic drug. Blood samples were taken over the expected useful life of the drug. And after a washout period, the groups were switched, and the branded group took the generic and vice versa, and the blood samples were taken a second time. And the area under the curve, the amount of basically the amount of active ingredient in the bloodstream had to be the same for both drugs and for both groups of patients. And there had to be an absence of any significant difference in the rate or extent that the active ingredient came in contact with the site of the drug's action. Bottom line is that the generic drug had to be made from the same USP active ingredient. It didn't have to have the same inactive ingredients, but it had to do the same work in the same way as the original drug. I know there's been a lot of controversy over the years as to whether generics are the same or not the same, whether they're inferior. Much of that has come from misleading marketing from pharma companies to try and uh, and and minimize competition. But the truth of today is that with 92% of all prescriptions, that's really over 5 billion prescriptions being filled with a generic drug. We don't really have uh, any significant instances where there have been giant failures of drugs. Obviously, there are cases from time to time of adulterated products that the FDA deals with, but there is no evidence whatsoever that that there's any real difference between brand and generic products. That said, um, it is the case that there are batch-to-batch variations, even from the same manufacturer, in the bioavailability of a drug. And so for those few drugs where with a narrow therapeutic index, where the difference between the amount of the drug that helps you and the amount of the drug that may cause undesirable side effects is present, it probably makes sense even today to titrate the patient to a single drug from a single known source, and to try and avoid changes in the source of manufacturing. One last comment on the whole bioequivalence issue, and that is that in today's markets, probably more than 50% of all the generic drugs are the branded drug made by a subsidiary of the original pharmaceutical company on the same manufacturing line that the branded drug was made. Um, and it's just the logo's left off, and the packaging is um, uh, made generic, but it's the identical drug beyond question. So to jump ahead, by the time we got to the early 80s, the generics were raring to go. They were pushing for this expedited approval process. The brand name companies saw the handwriting on the wall, particularly because almost every state in the country was adopting a mandatory substitution law, and the branded companies needed a new way to perpetuate their monopolies. So they went to Congress and said, we need longer patent life. That it takes 5 or 6 or 7 years for the FDA to approve our products, and if we're losing half of our monopoly, and we want that time given back to us. A compliant Congress basically was addicted to doing what the brand name companies wanted. Passed a bill, Senate passed it by 100 to 0, giving every drug 7 more years of patent life. In 1982, in what was a miraculous lobbying effort, Henry Waxman and a young congressman from Tennessee by the name of Al Gore Jr., who later became vice president, prevented the House from passing that bill by 2 votes. Were it not for that, there may never have been a generic drug industry. In the following year, in the midterms, the Democrats took control of the House. Henry Waxman became the chair of the health committee of the House, and he brought together the branded companies and the generic drug companies and said, we're going to make a deal. The branded companies are going to get some form of patent extension. We're going to work it out. The generic drug companies are going to get an expedited generic approval process. No more clinical trials required, merely proof of bioequivalence. And we're going to create a law in which when the basic patent on expires, generic competition will be on the market the next day. And in that way, we're going to have reasonable prices for older drugs and the incentive to invent new drugs because you're going to have longer patent life, and it's going to be a win-win situation for the world. I spent about 2 years commuting to Washington, putting together the details of that law, particularly the provisions on the patent side. And in 1984, the law came into effect. And for 20 years, probably from 1984 until the early 2000s, it looked like we had created a modern miracle. There was such a huge backlog of older drugs on which there was no generic competition, that patients were getting relief in the form of lower prices for older drugs. And at the same time, we seem to be in a what turned out to be a golden age for pharmaceuticals. It was the era of the blockbuster drug. It was a 20-year period in which first we had the beta blockers, then we got the cholesterol lowering drugs. We got the first generation of drugs to treat gastro reflux in Zantac and Pepcid. Then we got the second generation of GERD drugs in Nexium and Prilosec. We got the serotonin inhibitor antidepressant drugs. We had several classes of drugs produced with drugs with $1 billion of sales, and branded pharmaceutical sales in over 25-year period went from 20 billion to 250 billion, but it was not price increases. It was basically drugs that many of you are familiar with that cost somewhere between a dollar 50, and $4 a pill. So from the patient point of view, was perhaps $1,500 a year, or 2,000 at the outside. It was expensive, but the system seemed to be working, and it was being offset by the availability of the lower cost drugs. At that point, we came to something called the patent cliff in 2000, beginning around 2008 or 9, which was just a couple of years after Medicare Part D came into effect. Um, the patents on the cholesterol lowering drugs, hypertensive drugs, started expiring, and there was nothing to replace them. And there the and the discovery, the research and development being done at that point was largely related to the emerging biologics, and they were all specialty drugs that had much smaller um, uh, patient groups, and so the so the end result was this rapid rise in revenue started to end, and prescription drug business became a bit of a Ponzi. Between between 2009 and 2017, patent expirations on blockbuster drugs resulted in the loss of 185 billion of brand name sales to low cost generic competition, and it just wasn't possible for the big pharma companies to replace that revenue by introducing new drugs. So what did they do? They did two things, which sort of together proved that the law we had written in 1984 didn't make sense, or at least it didn't make sense any longer. Um, the first thing was they started raising prices uh, on on their older drugs that were still patented. And so during the same period that they lost 185 billion in sales, they added 195 billion through price increases. Um, and and on top of that, because the specialty drugs had smaller populations, they were launched at much higher prices. I mean, the granddaddy of the biologic drugs, Humira, which was launched in 2000, was originally launched at a cost of about $10,000 per patient. By the time it first got competition, which was last year, it was $50,000 per patient. So we get these huge price increases. The other problem, which was already known to exist, was that the pharma companies started gaming the patent system. By gaming the patent system, what I mean is that almost every drug that based on a new patent, on a new chemical entity, got a patent on that chemical entity, and that patent was a valid patent, and there was nothing you could do until that patent expired. But the drug industry started getting what we call secondary patents on minor changes to the drug that had no effect on safety or efficacy, But they were able to get patented because the patent office doesn't really know what it's doing. To give you a typical example, they would um, um, make a hydrate or salt of the original drug because and argue that it was more stable. The stability may have affected the expiration date, but it didn't affect the way the drug worked. And they use these bad patents to basically foment a lot of litigation. Um, and and in the end, we ended up with 10 or 12,000 patent litigations over really dumb stuff. I did some of the early patent litigations, and it's where the money came from to fund the philanthropy we engaged in. And the patents claimed metabolites of the original drug, which clearly weren't patentable and weren't even new. Um, they claimed different salt forms. They were Me Too drugs. They were just ways to delay competition for as long as they possibly could. On top of that, and to make matters worse, in 2010, as part of Obamacare, the Congress passed a generic drug law for biologics, and the and by then the game was known, and to the big pharma companies, they understood what they gave up and what they didn't like about Hatch-Waxman, and they convinced Congress not only to give every biologic drug 12 years of exclusivity, even if there were no patents, 12 years of complete freedom from any generic competition, but then to pile on hundreds of manufacturing patents and create what we call patent thickets that were designed to create 6, 8, 10 years of patent litigation uh, before a generic version of the biologic could be sold, and they are not even generic versions, which is the point I wanted to make. These drugs are called biosimilars. They are not bioequivalent, because no one knows for sure if the drugs are actually identical. You can prove that they're functionally they do the same thing in more or less the same way, but the science hadn't allowed us to get to a point, I think it's still not quite there, to prove actual interchangeability. And so there really is no generic market for biologics. You can't substitute the Humira biosimilar for Humira. You have to market it like you market a Me Too drug. The end result of that is that the discounts on the drugs are not that big and they're more expensive to make. And so in many cases, patients can't even afford the copays on the biosimilar, let alone the original drug. And the biologics are now the fastest growing part of the drug world. 60% of all drug expenditures are on biologic drugs. The use of small molecule drugs, while still important, is fading away. So that, in a nutshell, is sort of how we got here. And we're now facing a situation where the price of drugs is really determined by two things: how long the monopoly lasts, and the price is charged while the monopoly exists. And and the truth is, the monopolies last way too long. We're looking at 20 years or more in the case of most biologics, 15, 16 in the case of small molecules. And there is no control whatsoever over price. The first effort of any sort to deal with price controls, or with limiting price, and you can't even call it price controls, is the effort under the Inflation Reduction Act to negotiate prices in Medicare Part D. And if you actually look at what happened with the first 10 drugs, the prices that were actually negotiated, the prices that Medicare has agreed to pay are still more or less double what they are in Europe. Um, and the rollback of prices basically amounts to nothing, from my analysis, amounts to nothing more than a rollback of price increases to the extent those price increases exceeded inflation. Medicare now, finally, after 20 years, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, included a provision to limit price increases to the rate of inflation, which may ease things going forward. But so that's where we are. I'm looking. I don't know if we have questions, Neil. I want to make sure we leave time for questions. I do have a couple other topics I would want to touch on briefly. One is the role of PBMs. Maybe that'll come out in the questioning, and also the other thing, which I will sum up and finish with, is that um, is the fact that we are now operating with respect to R&D, which is hugely important. I mentioned earlier that the major drug companies no longer do basic research. They leave that to the NIH system. That system is hugely important because it's not economically driven. It is driven by the curiosity of young scientists, and it is creating an enormous amount of useful information. And because of where we are in the development of biomedical science, the information is fairly close to the product in the world of the genome, and uh, and that's all a good thing. The bad part of this is that the whole system operates under a law created in 1980 called the Bayh-Dole Act, in which the basic provision is that the universities end up with ownership of the patent rights created with federally funded grants, and are free to license or sell those patents to industry. And so we now have created a system in which venture capitalists roam the halls of academic medical institutions looking for new ideas to provide seed money. Um, these small startup companies are de-risking new ideas to a point where a big drug company comes along and buys it up for billions of dollars, and then marks up and then sets the price accordingly. And the government has no role, and nor do the universities play any role in limiting how much can be charged for that drug, and how much profit can be made on that drug, and or how long the monopoly should last on those drugs. What we've done essentially is socialize the cost and risk of discovery of new medicines and privatize the profits. And instead of now slashing the amount of money that we're putting into research, if Doge and Musk and the people that are doing this had any basic understanding of what is going on, they would be sitting there thinking, why isn't the government getting its share of the $600 billion industry, or at least getting back the 50 billion or more that it's spending on research that is the engine for everything that's happening. But it doesn't seem like anyone's much interested in dealing with that. And so we are now down to, Senator Cassidy, the new incoming chair of the Senate Health Committee, probably said it best, that a drug which a patient can't afford is the same as a drug which was never invented. And I fear that's where we're going. And let me leave it there.
It's a fascinating story. And, I really encourage people, if you're interested in this at all, the book just walks you through from the beginning to the end. And I think it's just really, it's phenomenal. If you want a copy of the book, you can either put your contact in the chat or afterwards, just send a note to eric.wildstein@mssm.edu. And Eric will collect the names and we'll be purchasing them in bulk. Let me take the opportunity to ask the first question, which is what, we've created this market through um, now you can't even turn on the television without drug ads. I mean, it's just unbelievable. You see so many people dancing through fields of flowers and playing volleyball on the beach and, and promoting all of these incredibly expensive drugs. And drug detailing is not like the big thing it used to be with thousands of people coming and knocking on doctors' doors. It seems like consumers are really driving the market, through what we're doing with these ads. Is there any sense of like how much that's contributed to what's going on in the market? And also,
Yes,
are there any
I
controls
can
over
tell you
that?
this. I can tell you this, Neil. Every study that's been done shows that, and this goes back 40 years, 50 years, that the amount of money which the drug companies, the big pharma companies, spend on marketing is more than double what they spend on research and development of new drugs. They're constantly pushing the market. It is not logical. I don't believe that drug advertising is allowed anywhere in Europe, other developed countries. And it's not logical that it should be allowed here because advertising something that you're prohibited by law from buying on your own doesn't make any sense. I mean, we don't see gun advertisements on TV for a long time, and it's only coming back recently. We didn't see liquor advertisements on TV. We still have beer, but not stronger alcoholic drinks. But um, but there's there's no chance that I'm aware of that you could roll this back because there are some court decisions um, allowing advertising on free speech grounds. To me, it makes no sense. But it is where it is, and the only thing I can perhaps there's some ways the government can deal with this on the reimbursement side, but there's no doubt patients come in and say, I want that drug that I saw on television.
Yep. So there's a question about whether or not the European pharmaceutical model would be viable in the US.
So the the, the answer is why isn't the European healthcare model overall viable in the US? I mean, the fact is that in Europe you have single payer systems. Some of them are private, like in Germany and France. You go to a network of private doctors. In the UK, their single payer system is public physicians. But um, and if you think about it, we spend probably 30 cents of the first 30 cents of every healthcare dollar, maybe a little more, figuring out who gets paid. The insurance company takes their cut, and then yeah, and then every hospital, every practice has a group of people who do nothing but negotiate with insurance companies. So to get paid. So we just don't like that system. And the European model when it comes to drugs is based on comparative cost effectiveness, comparative What the Europeans do is they look at a new drug, compare it to the drugs that are already available to treat the same ailment. They determine, you can say it's arbitrary, but they determine the value of the new drug as compared to the old drug. And they come up with a price and they say to the pharma company, this is the price we'll pay. And if you don't pay it, it will not be on our formulary and it will not be in our system. And the pharma companies accept it. And that price in recent years has been on average, you know, 30 to 50% of the price in the United States. I had urged the first Trump administration to simply adopt favored nations pricing, and listen to what Trump says every day. We're the biggest, we're the biggest consumer in the world. We should get the best price. He wouldn't pay more for concrete than the guy next door. But there's the pharma lobby is the biggest lobby in Washington. It spends twice as much as the insurance companies, which is the next biggest lobby. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars a year going into campaigns and uh, uh, and 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 also because so much of the industry and startups are now tied to academic medical centers. You have leading Democrats, Patty Murray and Maria Cantwell in Washington, Barbara Mikulski when she was senator, most liberal senator from Maryland, protecting the drug companies because of Hopkins. It's big business.
So Eric Gale, do you want to ask your question? You can unmute.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. The Martin Shkreli case where the generic pyrimethamine was raised from $13.50 to $750 per pill. And I think that was affirmed by the higher courts. Has that chilled the big pharma from taking these older drugs and rebranding them and increasing the cost?
No, I think what's happened is, and it's tied to another topic I just don't have time to get to. We Monopoly is a monopoly, whether you get it by the virtue of patent or whether it arises naturally because you have no competition. We've had in the last 20, 30 years major consolidation in the distribution networks in the pharmaceutical industry. There's probably no more than a half a dozen meaningful customers for any drug company. You've got two or three dominant chains, drug national drug chains. You only have one or two major wholesalers. You have hospital buying groups. So you had a situation originally where you had 10 generic companies making a drug, and there were only 5 customers. So eventually 5 of them had to go out of business. Then others went out of business. There was the buying groups drove the price of these drugs down so low that people just stopped making them. And suddenly, in the case of Daraprim, which I think is the drug you're talking about, there was only one supplier, and they were making $150 million on a year on the drug, charging $13 for a pill. And some wise guy from Wall Street comes along, buys up the company, and raises the price to $750 and gets headlines and ends up in jail for a bunch of other reasons. And the world discovers, he didn't do anything wrong. There's no law that says that you can't raise the price to anything you want. So there's no one at the FDA and no one anywhere else in government that's responsible for maintaining orderly markets and for making sure that that there's at least 2 or 3 viable suppliers for every drug. Now most hospitals, I don't know if it affects practices of people on this phone, but you've got these uh, sterile injectable drugs. Some of them are adjuvants for treating cancer patients that have been around for a long time. Cisplatin, I think, is one of them. Not big volume products. Nobody's making them because buying groups drove the profits down so low on the one hand, and then the FDA comes along and says, "Oh, there's this new $5 million piece of equipment you need to buy, can detect cross contamination down at X parts per million, and you have to have to install this machine now for safety purposes." And then and the generic manufacturer says, "No, thank you. I'd rather go out of business." Then you start scratching around the world to find a supplier. And maybe you'll find somebody in India or China, but it takes 3 years to get an approval. In the meantime, drug shortage. And if you can find the drug, it costs a fortune. It's just um, uh, it doesn't have to be that way. Um, and and but there's no one in charge of figuring out how to make it better.
Al, say a few words
Mm.
because it's so much in the news about PBMs and what's going on with this and why it's
So
become such a target.
So, so Neil, you've been around a long time, right? Every hospital had a formulary. PBMs, the idea of pharmacy benefit management is a great idea. The VA has a PBM. It's marvelous. You can go on their website. They look at it, they study every class of drugs, they put together every study and the job of the PBM was to make sure that the patient was dispensed the most effective drug at the lowest price. Um, and 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 we needed that because there were 8 drugs in a class, and when Lipitor went generic, suddenly doctors started prescribing Crestor, which was because they were getting promoted. The Crestor was getting promoted, and Lipitor wasn't getting promoted anymore. And somebody needed to be in there and say, no, 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 you don't need Crestor. You could take Lipitor or Simvastatin or whatever. That was the whole idea. They was just managing a formulary. Um, and so the originally hospitals did that, then PBMs did that. But then what happened is everything went generic. The reason we have 92% of prescriptions being filled with a generic is what 70% of healthcare is chronic illness, and the drugs we have for treating chronic illness and diabetes, hypertension, cardiac drugs. Most of what you're prescribing are drugs that have been around for 25 or 30 years. They're all generic. So you don't really have to choose between them other than if the patient's not doing well on one, you move them to another one, hoping it'll do better. But cost is not the consideration. It's so the PBMs needed to find another way to make money, and they and and the way they did it was basically to rip off people on generic drugs. One of the things I didn't talk about that I should have was just how inexpensive generic drugs really are. Most generic drugs wholesale at 90% discount from the branded product. The reality is that the cost of goods, if a branded drug sells for $1, the actual cost of the pill is 2 cents in most cases. And when a generic company makes that pill for 2 cents, and there's 10 other generic companies making the pill, they sell it for 3 cents. So some wholesaler or PBM is sitting there with a product that he got for 3 cents, and the branded product was $1. And you know how the mind works. He says, well, nobody's going to know that if I charge 10 cents, nobody's going to know the difference. It's still going to be a bargain. It's still going to be 90 cents left. Then it gets to 20 cents. Then it gets to 30 cents. And so at the end of the day, the middlemen who are doing nothing are just um, making money off the lack of transparency in prices and the spread. And then they added to that by starting to sell favored places and manipulating formularies. So to put a generic on an unpreferred tier and a generic Prilosec on an unpreferred tier and discounted Nexium on the same tier and make a ton of money for themselves. So, we don't need them.
Yeah.
I've advocated for in Medicare Part D that we don't need insurance at all for generic drugs. I mean, prescription for generic drugs is less than the bottle of beer. I mean, you can if docs were prescribing drugs as they should be for, filled one prescription for one time for the length of time between doctor's visits. So at least 180 pills. Uh, the cost of dispensing is more than the cost of the pills. We could save a lot of money. Government could just pay the pharmacist directly for the cost of the pills. The patient could pay a small dispensing fee, I think I've calculated we could save 25 billion a year in Medicare Part D just on generic drugs. But
Well, if it,
it doesn't fit in with the chainsaw. That's
yeah.
it's not dramatic enough.
Well, listen, I just want to say two things. You know, there's probably nobody that's had as much impact on the pharmaceutical industry who's not in the pharmaceutical industry than you have. And I've just been listening to these stories as they've evolved over decades of our relationship, and just want to, say publicly again, how indebted we are to you. You are really the only philanthropist, the only person that hooked on to the work that the Institute was doing way back when, and you've stuck by us all these years. You know, I forgot to mention that you built our Mount Hope Family Practice Center. It's still thriving. We just renovated it, and you've done so much in terms of starting the department at Beth Israel and then at Sinai, and really believed in us as an organization and for the work that we were doing. And just incredibly grateful to you for all of those years of support. And hope that we can continue this relationship and that you'll continue it with my successors, and that we'll be able to keep working together. And it's been a privilege.
Well, thank you, Neil. It's been a privilege and a pleasure to know you and to work with you and I I'm I did what I did because the work you do and the healthcare you provide is and your people provide is should be the norm and should be the standard in this country. And if we were doing that uniformly and across the country, we'd be saving a lot of money and improving the health of a lot of people. And just always seemed to me that I was very fortunate to make a lot of money exploiting the flaws in the system, and felt it was the right thing to do to try and put some of it back to actually do some good. So I thank you for providing me an outlet for doing that.
Well, it was a great grand rounds. I hope people will enjoy the book. It really is a great read. It almost reads like a novel where you're just waiting to see what happens from chapter to chapter, because
It's like a thriller.
Yeah, you know where we ended up and what the mess looks like today. It's just people, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to hear the story and the evolution of it. And I think you did a great job today in an hour of summarizing it. And there's a lot more detail, and for people that want to know more, it's a great read. So we'll have a lot of requests, and we'll be getting them in bulk. So thanks everybody for joining us in Grand Rounds. Thanks, Al, for being here with us, and have a great day.
I'll
Thanks,
see you
Al.
at the gala.
Yep.
Yeah, take care.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.